Greetings, men of 222. It's great to be with you today. And we're going to continue on in our Common Men, Uncommon Stories series. And today we're going to talk about Mordecai. Mordecai was a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, and you can read about his story in the book of Esther. In fact, I'm not able to get over the entire thing today, so I want you to know that when you want to find out the rest of the story about Mordecai and Haman, you really need to read that book. It's a fascinating book. It's only 10 chapters long, very small, and chock full of great stuff. So what can we learn from Mordecai? Well, we learn four things at least. One is he is a man of tremendous responsibility because he takes in Esther after her parents die. And granted, that is a Jewish edict that they're supposed to do that, but he didn't have to. We saw in the story of Boaz that the next of kin did not take Ruth, but in this case, Mordecai did take Esther, raised her as his own daughter, and did a whale of a job doing that. We also see that he was a man of mature discernment because he told Esther to keep her heritage, that she was a Jew, if you will, secret when she was called into the king's presence. Mordecai told of the plot to kill the king. He was strong and courageous because he went out on a limb to tell about these two guys that were trying to kill him, the king. And lastly, Mordecai is the one who told Esther that it was probably for such a time as this, we hear that all the time, for such a time as this, that she had become royalty. He understood her and his unique calling. So who was Esther? Well, we have to start with King Ahasuerus, who reigned in India to Ethiopia, 120, a huge landmass, right? And he had just been beaten in a battle, and he was kind of sulking. So he threw a 6-month party. That's right, a 6-month party. The last 7 days of which were an absolute binge drinking party. And in the process, he then summoned for his queen at that time, whose name was Vashti. And Vashti, knowing that he was drunk and probably going to ridicule her, but we don't know that part, but we know she knew he was drunk, refused to come. And when she did that, Ahasuerus got crazed because Ahasuerus and his counselors realized that if Vashti refused his order, that perhaps even women in the kingdom would refuse to obey their husbands. And so Ahasuerus could have had her killed, but he chose not to. He just had her demoted, so to speak, and he began to look for another queen. And he sent this edict and decree out, and he said, find me the most beautiful young women that you can, bring them into the palace. We will give them a year's worth of primping. We'll let them eat the right stuff and just make themselves as beautiful as they can. And at the end of that year, each one will come in to me, and if I like her and I call her by name, she can come back again. If I don't, she'll just join the harem. Well, Esther pleased King Ahasuerus, and he so much so that he decided to make her queen. That is how she became queen. So, what's Mordecai's story? Well, Mordecai, as we said, had taken Esther in to be his own daughter after the death of her parents. And when she was taken to the palace, Mordecai said, don't let them know you're Jewish, because a lot of folks don't like Jews, and that could be a bad deal for you. Very mature on his part. But Mordecai was kind of the original helicopter parent. He wanted to be so close to her that he actually sat at the king's gate because he couldn't get in the palace, but he got as close as he could, and he sat there all the time to know and hear about Esther as much as he could. But while there, he heard about a plot. Two guys had decided that they wanted to kill King Ahasuerus, and they were going to lay their hands on him, but not in a biblical fashion. They were going to try to kill him. And he got word to Esther, and Esther told the king, and she gave Mordecai, very smart, she gave Mordecai credit for the information, and the king had it written down in the book of Chronicles. And this is, of course, after he stopped the plot. And I can imagine what happened to those two fellas. But Mordecai developed an enemy in the process, Haman, who was the king's second in command. And Haman hated Mordecai because Mordecai would not bow down to him. So here you have the guy that's the second dude titularly in the kingdom, and Mordecai won't bow. Why is that? Well, because Deuteronomy 6:13 and 14 says this. It was something that was taught to the Jews. It said, "You shall fear only the Lord your God, and you shall worship him and swear by his name. You shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who surround you. For the Lord your God in the midst of you is a jealous God." Serve God only. Well, that's how Mordecai felt, and he wouldn't bow to Haman, and it really hacked him off. But it reminds me of the advice. Coach Dwyer gave me a CD from the singing group Salvador, and on that CD, the lead singer's parents are pastors, and they told him when he left home, they said, "Don't just honor Jesus." And I thought, wow, why wouldn't you honor Jesus? And then they said, honor Jesus only. And that's what you and I should do. We live in a very politicized world, and some of us tend to worship the Republican Party and some of us the Democratic Party. And the fact of the matter is that we should only be worshiping the true God, period. And we should be doing what God says, not what political parties say. And whether that may be unpopular, but it's a fact. Because if we look at it and we say, we're only going to minister to Democrats or Republicans, well, at least 50% of the nation will not get to hear about Jesus Christ. And that's really what we're here for in the first place. So as a result of Haman's dislike for Mordecai, he began to plot to have all the Jews killed, so he could get Mordecai in the process. And in Esther 3:8, Haman said to King Ahasuerus, he said, "There's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. And their laws are different from those of all other people, and they don't observe the king's laws. So it's not in the king's interest to let them remain. Let's kill them." Holy moly. I mean, here's a situation where he sets it up pretty well, doesn't he? He said, look, they're peculiar people. They have different laws. They don't obey your laws. We need to get rid of them. And of course, Ahasuerus said, oh, okay. And so he wrote an edict, and we're going to read about that edict in a moment. But Haman had cast lots to determine when it would be appropriate to go to Ahasuerus and when the Jews should be killed. And the Assyrian word for lots, for casting lots, is pur, P-U-R. And later, this will become the Feast of Purim. That's how the name of the feast comes about. So in Esther 3 and 13, here's what it said. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, listen to this, to destroy, to kill, and annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar, and to seize their possessions and plunder. Holy mackerel. Here we are, we're going to take them all out in one day. When Mordecai heard this, Esther sent a man to him and told him this. When he heard it, he tore his clothes and he sat in sackcloth and ashes, which was a Jewish reaction to bad news. And in Esther 4, 13 and 14, Mordecai sent her back word, and he said to her this. He said, "Do not imagine that you are in the king's palace and can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." Now let's take that verse apart a little bit. Isn't it interesting that Mordecai, look at his wisdom, his mature discernment here. He says, Esther, if you remain silent, God is still going to save the Jewish people because they are his chosen people. But you and your father's household are all going to die because you kept silent. And he said, furthermore, he knows, who knows whether you have not attained royalty at this very moment for such a time as this. So she had a dilemma. She needed to speak up, but no one could go to the king unless the king summoned them. And if you went to the king on your own, and if he didn't point the scepter at you, you could be killed if he was bothered that you came and bothered him. So here's what Esther said to Mordecai. She said, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maidens will also fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, who is not according to the law, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. Wow, what courage from this young woman. But just like Daniel, she knew that prayer and fasting was critical. God, however, was moving ahead of Esther and Mordecai, because on the night before she was going to go to the king, he couldn't sleep. And in the process of not being able to sleep, he went and got the book of Chronicles to read it to put him to sleep. And in the process of that, he read about Mordecai and how Mordecai had saved his life by telling him about the plot. And he also recognized in the process of that he had not done anything to reward Mordecai. So, Mordecai's deed, good deed, if you will, was at the top of mind right now. So she said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in your sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. There was a problem. In those days, when the king made a law, he couldn't rescind the law. The law was the law. It had to stay into effect. That's the way laws were. So the only thing that the king could do was to write another law which was to counterbalance that law. And so in Esther 8 and 11, he wrote a letter and in them the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and then they could take the plunder and the spoil. Well, as I said, in the time allotted today, I can't tell you the whole story, but Haman gets his, and Mordecai is exalted in the court of the king. It's worth reading the book of Esther. As I say, it's only 10 short chapters. It's easy reading. And when the Jews protected themselves and waxed all these people who were going to kill them, they celebrate to this day the Feast of Purim, which is a feast designed to remember what God has done for the Jewish people. And by the way, I want you to look at evangelism God style. Esther 8 and 17 says this, in each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many of the peoples of the land, listen to this, many of the peoples of the land became Jews. For the dread of the Jews had fallen upon them. You see, they were the recognition that they were God's chosen people. So these days were remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews or their memory fade from their descendants. That's why to this day they celebrate the Feast of Purim. So what takeaways can we get out of this book? Well, there are a number. Mordecai was certainly a man of responsibility. We see that over and over again. He took Esther in. He was strong and courageous. He not only was responsible in reporting the plot, but it took strength and courage to do that. He told Esther to keep her secret about being Jewish. That was mature discernment. But he also told her that if she didn't speak up, she was going to die. And maybe it was that God had placed her where he had placed her for just such a time as this. And lastly, he recognized that it was a unique calling to be placed where she was for such a time as this. Hey, be intentional this week as you honor Jesus. See you next Saturday, Lord willing, and the creeks don't rise.